Hey everybody, it's Courtney and I'm here with another project for Trinity stamps. Today I'm going to be using the Bouquet of Hope stamp set and I'm going to use this large image right there in the center. I'm going to be creating a one-layer scene card here, and I knew what I wanted to do, but I wanted to make sure that my placement was correct, my measurements were correct. I did measure the stamp so that I would have enough room on my card panel. What I want this to appear to look like is she is standing in an open door. So I guess at your doorstep. So as if we were looking in from the inside and she's standing outside. So I have this sped up a lot, but I'm going over everything with a pencil first to make sure that I have my measurements correct and that it looks okay before I go in with my pen and darken up the lines a little bit before I start my coloring. Now for the door, the lines will be angled because the door is open and it's perspective wise it would appear to be angled. So once I was happy with all of my placement here, including my little hardwood floor that I created, I'm going to go ahead and take an EK Success journaling pen and go over all of my lines. And this is a Copic safe pen. I'm going to do all Copic coloring here. I'm not doing any ink blending at all. The entire panel will be covered with Copics. I won't show you this entire thing. You'll be able to see kind of the finished product afterwards, and we'll move on to the stamping. Before I did do my coloring and stamping, I did erase all of my pencil lines that might be kind of showing through some of those black lines there. Once you color over pencil lines, you're not going to be able to erase them, so just be sure to erase them ahead of time. I'm using my Misty here just because this is a huge image and I had a feeling I may have to stamp her twice. And I realized she didn't quite fit in that doorway. So I'm going to go ahead and use some Post-it note tape here just to mask out the sides or that opening of the door frame. And I'll place my cardstock back in my Misty. I'm not going to be able to line it right up there with the corner anymore because of the Post-it note tape, but I'll just use my magnet and the adhesive from the tape will kind of keep that in place. Once I had her lined up and stamped, I did realize that I was going to have to stamp her twice. So I was pretty thankful I used my Misty. Once she was stamped out, I went ahead and removed my Post-it note tape and we'll move on to the Copic coloring. And I will speed this up quite a bit as well, just because this took me quite a while. I'm going to start off with her. I'll start off with my skin tones here, and I'm laying out my darkest areas with my lightest color. This is the E50. Darkest areas will be on the inside of her arms and where her arms are bent, and also the inside of her legs where they meet, as well as her little kneecaps there. Next, I'll go in with my darkest color. This is the E04, basically going over those same areas and just darkening those up. I did also add a little bit of shading to the top of her hands. I did just add a little 2 flicks where her little kneecaps are. This illustration is amazing and gives you all of the placement of your shadows and where they should be. Next, I'll go in with my E13 and just thicken up some of those lines. And this is my darkest midtone. You don't have to use 4 colors here. I'm just used to picking up at least 3 or 4. Next, I'll go in with my lightest midtone. This is the E01, thickening up those areas even more, just leaving a very small area for my highlight color. And we'll go back to that E50 and blend all of those colors out. Then we will move on to her little dress, and I'm going to be coloring her dress purple. I'm using my V0 markers. And again, just starting off with my lightest color to map out my darkest areas. For the top part of her dress, the shadowing would be underneath where the flowers are kind of hanging down, underneath the stems, and underneath her arms. And for the skirt part, the lines within the illustration are there to help you. So I'm basically just going over them And right now you can't really tell because it's the lightest color, but I'm just putting a little bit of saturation down on my paper to make the blending easier. I'm also on the bottom of her skirt where those lines are, or where the skirt is kind of folded. I'm just doing small little triangles, and right from those top of the line down, I'm just thickening up those lines, if that makes sense at all. This is the V09, again, just going over those very darkest areas. I'm not doing any kind of shading with my darkest color on the sides of her skirt. I'll do that with my darkest midtone, which is the V06. Thickening up those lines a little bit, as well as the lines in her skirt. I will also create a shadow underneath the little belt and on either side of her skirt, as well as these lines and the little triangles that we created there on the bottom. Next, I'll go in with my lightest midtone, which is, this is the V04, which is very similar to the V06. It's just a little bit more pinky. And I just extended those lines out even further. For the top part of her dress, there's not going to be much room for a highlight. Most of the highlighting is going to be in her skirt, which is where all of the dimension is anyway. Extending those lines for the folds as well as those little triangles. Then I'll go back to my V01 and fill in all of the remaining areas. Now I did have a little bit of problem blending her skirt. The V01 and V04 are pretty far apart. So I'm just using the tip to tip technique here. So I'm just touching the tip of my V01 to the V04, and just that helps blend out those little areas, but I'm still left with that highlight. Next, I'll move on to the flowers, and I'm not going to show you all of these. I'm just showing you the color combinations. The darkest area will be right there in the center of the flower. I'll blend that out with my mid-tone and then fill that in with my lightest color. I'm coloring these flowers two different colors. Some of them will be yellow, some of them will be this magenta light color. For my yellows, my darkest color is the YR68, blending that out with the Y38 and then the Y35. For the centers of the flowers, I'm going to use a yellow for the magenta flowers, and then I will use like a burnt orange type color for the yellow flowers. And for the stems, they're actually just the black line, so you don't have to worry about the stems, but there are some leaves here, and there's probably some petals that I may have missed. I'm going to color them in solid green as if they were leaves, just to give a little bit more color to that bouquet. If you're not sure what they are, because some of these flowers are kind of laying over other ones, I just colored them green. They're going to appear to be leaves. Nobody's going to know the difference. Next, we'll move on to the actual background of the card. I'm going to start with the opening of the door, and I have this sped up, I think, like 4 times because it obviously takes a while and there's not much blending here. But I'm just going in with my B02 and going on the outer part of that door frame, and I'm doing a solid line along my black drawn line there, and then flicking that out just to make it easier to blend when I bring in my B00. And I'm only using 2 colors here. I'm not really worried about getting all that much dimension in the background of her. And I just went in between the little flowers and blended that B02 out all the way to the middle. Next, we'll move on to the door. Before I do that, I wanted to take that EK Success Journaling pen and add a little bit more to the middle of the door. I don't know what these parts are called, but you know, the parts of the door that are kind of indented, just to give them a little bit more dimension before I start my coloring. I'm going to be using my warm gray markers for the door, and I'm starting with these little indented parts here. And I'm starting off with my darkest color because the warm grays just blend very well together. And I'm just going on the outer part of this and then just drawing a straight line right there in the center, just to give that a little bit of dimension. Then I will move on to my W5 and extend those lines out a little bit further. There's really no rhyme or reason as far as my shading here. I wasn't, to be honest, sure where to put the shading. I just wanted to have this part of the door stand out a little bit from the rest of the door. Next, I'll move on to the W3, and that is the lightest color that I'm going to use on these parts of the door. And I'm just extending those out and blending those out a little bit. I did, for that line right there in the center in the bottom part, I did take my W5 and extend that out more towards the top and bottom. For the door itself, my darkest area will be away from her. So I'm going with my darkest color and just creating some flicks right there on the edge of my card panel. Then I will take my darkest mid-tone and extend those flicks out a little bit further. Next, I'll go in with my W3 and extend those out even further yet, past those little openings. And it's okay if you go directly over them because that was your lightest color for that area of the door anyway. And then finally, I will go in with my lightest color, which is my W1, and blend the rest of those areas out for the door. Once my door was all done, I will move on to the door frame, I think it's called, or moldings, or whatever it's called. And I wanted these to appear to be wood. So I'm using my E30 markers, and I'm going to start with my E31 and fill in the entire area, including that little molding or baseboard there that I had created against the wall or on the floor. So I filled all of these areas in with that E31. And for my shading, I didn't trust myself enough to make a thin line that was straight. So I did for this little area, but then I brought in my T-squared ruler again to make sure that my lines were completely straight. I knew I just wanted to add just a little bit of this E37, which is the darkest color, and I just didn't trust myself enough. So I use the T-squared ruler for the E37. Then I'll go in with the E33 and extend that out a little bit further. I didn't feel the need to use my T-square ruler for this part. And then finally, I will go back in with that lightest color, that E31, and blend all of that out, including that little baseboard there that we have there on the floor. Now for the floor, I also wanted this to appear to be wood, like a hardwood floor, but I wanted to make it a little bit different from the moldings or the door frame. So I'm going in with my E50 markers, and I'm going to start with my lightest color, which is the E53, and I'm going to cover the entire floor to start, just to saturate my paper. This will make the blending a little bit more easier. Next, I will go in with one of my mid-tone colors here, and I'm just going to create some shadowing on either side. I'm yelling at my cat here, sorry. And I'm just doing little squiggly lines, and I'm barely touching my marker to the paper. This isn't going to be one of those in-depth tutorials on how to do wood grain. This is just a small part of the card, and you're really not even going to notice it. With that same color, I'm going to create some shadows on either side of the door so that the lightest part will be from the light coming in through the door. And this is Macy. Frankie was in a video a few weeks back, and now she wants to make her appearance. So I'm just making my darkest areas being on either side of that little door, and then I'll go in with my E55 and extend those out just a little bit. I am using a little bit of flicking here just to make sure that my blending is a little easier. And then she's knocking around the camera. And then I'll go back in with the E53 and cover up that entire area. Now last, for the wall, I wanted to keep this white, but there is still shading when an object is white. And this is where the card started going downhill. So I started with my C3, which is going to be my darkest color. It's not very dark at all, but I just wanted to add a little bit of shading. Again, didn't really trust myself to make a straight line, and I used my T-square ruler. But I didn't clean off my T-square ruler after using it with the E37, and I didn't realize that at the time, and I was wondering where all this brown was coming from, but it had come from my ruler. I go back in constantly with my colorless blender to try to smooth some of that brown out. Eventually, I was able to take all of it up. But once I have the C3 down, I take my C1 and flick that out almost all the way to the edge of the card panel. Now, you will see these flicks, so I take my colorless blender and kind of go over the entire area just to smooth out those flick marks. Here's where I noticed that my brown was still coming back, not sure where it was coming from, not realizing that it was on the tip of my marker. So I did have to scribble that on a scrap piece of paper to kind of get rid of that. But for some reason, I just kept getting these brown streaks all over my wall here. So you'll see I did go back and forth quite a bit to fix that up. Once all my coloring was finally done, I'll move on to the sentiment. Now, I wasn't sure where I wanted this to be placed. I ultimately decided to put it on the bottom part of the door opening. And you'll see here that I have another streak of that brown on my wall there. I'm checking my hands, seeing if I have it on there. I couldn't figure out where this was coming from, so I had to take my colorless blender again and fix that. Then I went ahead and stamped my sentiment right there, kind of like where her knees are. Now you'll see in the final pictures that I ended up white heat embossing this on a black strip of cardstock and popping that up with foam tape. I didn't really like it being flat. It kind of just covered her up a little bit too much. But that is it for the card today, guys. Thanks so much for stopping by, and hope you guys have a wonderful day. Bye.